Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner. Dedication for those who enjoy stories. Prologue. Fight or Flight. Heavy padded feet beat a soft cadence along a leaf-riddled path. The rhythmic sound of leather straining against buckles kept tempo with every step. A flash of crimson danced in the dappled light that cascaded through tree canopies. Felix Hemmings swayed in a stupor. He was hot, and the tree cover did little to abate the midday sun on the forest. He pulled at the straps that fastened his leather gambeson and pauldron together, desperate for a reprieve. His cinnamon-colored fur was slick with sweat, and mercifully a slight breeze lifted the hair as the gambeson fell open. "My prince," said a familiar voice. Sitting up straighter in the saddle, Felix looked around groggily. The young rabbit rubbed his eyes to clear his vision, then passed his paws up his long ears, tousling the fur to make as much use of the slight breeze before it escaped. "Captain Wattle, report," he said dully. "All is well," replied Wattle, idly slapping a pair of reins against his palm. "Oh, I'm sorry. I think I lost my wits for a bit. The heat of the day. Also, the Lightbearer training is—" Felix paused, searching for the right word. "Thorough, to say the least." In truth, Felix felt exhausted, not only physically, but mentally as well. Physical training by day and hard study by night. When his father's summons had arrived a week into his studies at the temple, pronouncing that he would oversee the Wolfbond Treaty, he could scarcely hide his excitement. The thought of leaving the stuffy, yet beautiful, marbled halls of the Lightkeeper Temple and escaping to the open countryside was exhilarating. That's to be expected, I suppose," Wattle said. "Every Landoran ruler is summoned to the temple when they are chosen as heir, but no ruler before you could actually use the power, not without help from the Crimson Catalyst." Wattle beamed at Felix, drinking in the sight of the young prince with a knowing eye. "No, you, my boy, you are something special, something different. Landor will never be the same if you take the throne." He turned his attention back to the trail. Felix felt somewhat flushed and looked down at his paws gripping the reins. This was high praise coming from the captain, and he hoped his embarrassment didn't show in the color of his ears. A heavy ring of silver, entwined with a deep scarlet jewel, adorned the prince's left paw. The crimson catalyst flickered as the sun's rays caught the cut gem, sending thousands of fiery tendrils in every direction. Something never seen before, Felix thought to himself. Looking back at the captain, he took in the sight of the veteran rabbit riding next to him. A few flecks of gray were peppered around his brown muzzle. Some might say he was slightly gone to seed, as his hauberk was tighter in the middle than most. Regardless, no finer buck could be found in the Three Kingdoms. Felix took in rein and glanced around at the unfamiliar forest about him. "Where are we exactly?" he questioned. "Say, about 3 miles outside Midcopse, I believe. I sent scouts ahead. They should be back here shortly. That mount of yours must be a smooth ride if you can stay astride while half dreaming," Wattle stated. Felix reached down to scratch the neck of the tawny lion he rode. "Honor really is the pick of the litter," Felix said proudly. "The only way he'd let you fall is if you threw yourself from the saddle." Captain Wattle chuckled slightly. "Wish I could say the same about Mara here. Give her half a chance and she'd be off chasing deer in the underbrush, whether you are atop her or not." He slapped his reins gently against his mount's neck. The lioness gave a start and pranced sideways, hindquarters bouncing into the air as she wandered into Honor's path. "Ho, ho!" Wattle exclaimed with a laugh. "See what I mean? She's got spunk, this one." The captain maneuvered Mara away from Honor, lest their tack get tangled in one another. A few of the rear guard chuckled at the feistiness of Mara. Felix looked around at their small company of soldiers, his protection. They totaled 8, all foot strong to the buck. 2 scouts with longbows made of yew, and 4 strong heavy guard, himself and the captain. The armored guard wore padded jerkins beneath chainmail shirts. They carried spears, whose leaf-shaped heads, made of steel, reached high above them upon long shafts. There they brushed against the underside of the leaf canopy, mingling amongst their natural kin. Each soldier marched resolutely, never losing pace in the wake of the 2 mounted riders upon their lions. "Do you think we have enough, Captain?" Felix asked candidly, as to not be overheard. "Prince Felix, we are going to a peace treaty, not the front line," Waddle admonished. "I picked these lads myself, and I can assure you, out of anyone else in all the capital, they have the utmost loyalty to your father, and to you." Captain Waddle turned in his saddle, looking around at the guard. He lifted his voice and yelled, "What are you?" "Barabon, until the leaves falter," the guard yelled in reply, and started up a low campaign song that kept tempo with their armored footfalls. The song did not have words, but the soldiers hummed and clashed their armaments upon the ground or thumped their mail, giving it life. Captain Waddle stared pointedly at Felix. "Point well taken, Captain," Felix said resigned. The spirit of camaraderie was amongst the soldiers as their song faded, yet Felix felt apart. The song was for those who had shared the same toil, and he was their responsibility, not a comrade. The prince pushed the sudden feelings of loneliness away and addressed the captain again. "I still feel that Vladimir should be here with us. These accords concern him as much as they do me. The Sierra Pack will have to parley with him in other matters when I'm busy with duties the temple set me," Felix protested. "There's merit in what you say, but you can't ask a person to be away from their family at a time like this, even if he is your brother. The pregnancy has been very harsh on Nona this time around," Waddle said concerned. "No, the best thing for you to do is your duty, and for he to do his. All the rest will work itself out." Captain Waddle suddenly lifted himself up in the saddle. "Ah, I think I see the scouts returning." Waddle spurred Mara to a lope, and the lioness sprung ahead to meet the scouts, who had just appeared from the underbrush. Felix sat for a moment, watching the older rabbit ride away, thinking about his duty and what this meeting meant for Landor. Felix felt a mountain of pressure weighing down on his stomach. Do your duty. The old rabbit's words seemed to reverberate in his ears. He would bring the Sierra Pack into the fold. Felix frowned and dug his heels into the sides of Honor, kicking the lion into a reluctant lope, chasing after Captain Waddle. The captain had dismounted and was in deep conversation with the scouts, who gestured towards the wood line as Felix slowed Honor to a stop next to Mara. Moments later, the rear guard arrived, heavy chain clinking as they ran, with spears held out so as to not hinder their movement. They did not seem perturbed at the sudden escape of their charges, but merely fell in line, forming up with practiced precision. Captain Waddle waved his paw at the 2 scouts, who immediately sprinted back the way they'd come. The scouts' gray fur blended with the tree shadows so well they were out of sight in the blink of an eye. "Well?" Felix asked, looking down as Captain Waddle returned to his mount. "They say the clearing for the meeting is about 3/4 of a mile ahead, but no sign yet of the Sierras." Waddle huffed as he swung into Mara's saddle. "Should we be worried?" Felix asked tensely. "Our envoys confirmed they were willing to meet." Captain Waddle was thoughtful for a moment, absent-mindedly slapping the reins on his paw. Probably just some damn fool trick of the Sierras." he finally said. They want to seem clever right up till the end. Even though they lost the war, their pride won't allow for humility. Come along, the sun is 3 bells past midday, and I don't fancy being in these parts after dark, not with Wellborough so close. Felix snorted before he could catch himself. Surely, Captain, you don't believe? Felix said tentatively, trying to recover from his rudeness. Captain Waddle's face turned uncharacteristically hard. They might be doe wives' tales to scare the burrowlings, he said seriously. Still, I'd rather be back in an inn with an L in my paw, if it's all the same come dark. Even if my old gran was wrong, shifters aren't the only thing to fear once night falls. Captain Waddle tapped the sides of Mara, and she moved ahead steadily. Felix sat staring in disbelief, unsure if Captain Waddle was being serious or not. It wasn't the first time the old veteran had gone around the thorn bush to pull his tail. Superstition or not, Felix agreed that being in the forest after nightfall was foolish. If the negotiations went long for whatever reason, they might have to camp in the open, and the prince didn't relish that thought. Felix nudged Honor into a walk and fell in behind Waddle. Before long, the forest became thicker and wilder. The path narrowed, and the company was forced to march single file. More than once they had to stop so that the rear guard could clear the path. They whacked savagely at the underbrush with their daggers so that Honor and Mara had enough room to pass. The canopy of the trees here was so thick that barely any sun reached the forest floor. When sunlight did struggle past the green guardians, it cut through the gloom in golden pillars, brightly defiant against the backdrop of dark brown sentinels. Captain Waddle was silent, consumed in his own counsel. Felix felt uneasy. The old tales of Wellborough seemed much more plausible amid the dark trees and deep shadows. The snapping of a branch and a rustling of leaves sounded off the path as the scouts melted out of the shadows a few paces away. The first scout saluted, bringing his fist to his chest. "What news?" Captain Waddle asked sternly.
"They showed themselves about 10 minutes ago, far side of the clearing,"
the scout reported. He moved covertly towards a thicket and pushed aside the cover to reveal a large clearing completely devoid of trees. Felix gazed out upon the clearing and immediately felt there was something unnatural about it. The thick trees, which stood all about them, just abruptly stopped. This created a ringed wall of watching sentinels around a large knoll of short, cropped grass, which looked as if it had been curated by the best gardeners of Landor. "How many are there?" Waddle asked.
"We've only seen the 2,
the scout said,
but the big one fits the description of their commander."
"Very well," Captain Waddle said to the scout. "Keep to our flanks and have a sharp eye." He looked at each member of the company. "Everyone, keep your nerve, and today will change history." The older rabbit's gaze lingered on the prince. "Felix, now is the time," he said solemnly. Felix swallowed hard and squared his shoulders. Then, sitting upright in his saddle, he nudged Honor forward. The lion picked his way through the tall grass that divided the tree line and edge of the clearing. Astride Honor, Felix could see clearly above the taller grass to the far side of the knoll as 2 large figures emerged from the shadow of the trees. Both were wolves, well-muscled with lanky frames. Their fur was mostly gray with flecks of brown, and they had a shaggy quality. The taller of the 2 made a motion with his paw, and the other fell back as he moved into prominence. This wolf was sable, with much more black in his fur than his companion. The thick, dark fur stuck out wildly from a jerkin of boiled leather armor, giving him a savage look. The leather was stained black and reinforced with metal plates inside, studded together with tiny hammered rivets which dotted the armor's face. At his waist was tied a black satin sash, over which a 1.5-hand longsword was belted in a cobalt blue scabbard. The wolf moved with a grace that suggested he knew how to use that blade. He maneuvered his way through the long grass, right to the edge of the manicured knoll, where he stopped and waited with large, dangerous eyes fixed upon Felix. Felix dismounted Honor and pulled the reins over his mount's head, then passed them to Captain Waddle. The prince went to the side of his saddle and pulled at a few straps to release his long sword that was attached near the pommel. As the blade came free, he noticed the abnormal weight. The sword was slightly longer than he was accustomed to. It had been an appeasement gift from his brother, given to him in haste as he left the capital for this meeting. Felix smiled to himself slightly, remembering his brother's excitement as he exclaimed that his niece would be awaiting their return. Felix looked across the knoll at the waiting wolf, and his spirits sank again. "Do your duty," echoed in his mind. Felix pulled on a pair of leather gloves, then belted on the new longsword. Once he had run out of excuses to delay what must be done, he steeled himself, turned, and walked resolutely towards the wolf, who did likewise. The two approached one another, the wolf with easy, measured grace, the rabbit with stiff determination, until they were a conversation's length apart. The wolf's amber eyes never left Felix. They were calculating and alert. Also, he didn't seem to need to blink as often as others. Felix blanched slightly. He felt he should speak first, but when he tried, he found his mouth was bone dry under the wolf gaze, and his words failed. After the prince cleared his throat a few times, he tried again, this time with success. "My name is Felix Hemmings, son of Doman Hemmings." Felix's voice sounded higher than he expected, but he was relieved to hear it steady and did not betray the unease he felt. "I am prince to the throne of Landor, and I have come to see a pact made between Landor and the Sierra Pack." The wolf merely stared at this pronouncement, his eyes searching Felix's face, but he said nothing. The prince started to feel ruffled and cleared his throat nervously as the silence stretched. Long and longer still the silence tarried, to an uncomfortable span, until finally the prince could not stand the quiet any longer. He opened his mouth to engage again when the wolf finally spoke.
"I'm Wrath,"
the wolf said shortly. His voice was graveled and rough. Silence again. A forlorn breeze crested the knoll, tickling the short grass. "Longfang," Felix breathed, despite his effort to remain composed. Wrath's ear twitched a fraction, and a sly, toothy grin split his muzzle.
"My pack prefers deeds instead of titles,"
he said. His voice was cultured, but it still had a hint of the harsh mountain dialect from whence he came. Felix stood transfixed. The afternoon sun was hot on the back of his neck. Sweat beaded around the corners of his short muzzle and seeped into his eyes, which stung. He shook himself mentally, remembering his purpose. "I've agreed to meet with you to discuss the terms of the Wolf Bond Treaty," Felix said formally. Tap, tap, tap. Felix looked at Wrath for acknowledgement, but when he locked eyes with the wolf, he continued on quickly, finding it easier to keep speaking than suffer that piercing gaze overly long. "The Sierra Pack will desist all hostilities towards the Kingdom of Landor, and, in so doing, be granted citizenship and all amenities that come with being a citizen of the kingdom." Tap, tap, tap. Felix paused, distracted. He felt his words were shallow and had a fixed, learned-by-heart feel, yet he was determined and continued on all the same. As a citizen of Yonder, you will be privy to all of the... Tap, tap, tap. Felix stopped, disturbed. He looked across at Wrath. The wolf was standing leisurely, watching him speak, and tapping the point of his sharp claw upon the hilt of his sword. Felix cleared his throat and tried to pick up his monologue. And as a legal citizen, tap, tap, tap. Felix faltered again, finding it impossible to go on under the keen amber eyes of the wolf watching him, and so he succumbed to silence. Wrath took a long breath and scratched slowly at the fur under his neck.
Felix,
he said roughly. Prince Hemmings, interrupted Felix pointedly. Wrath gave another grin, sharp pearls creasing his dark muzzle. The wolf began to pace, slowly one way, then the other, with a languid grace that bespoke speed, strength, and always with eyes that never left Felix.
Prince Hemmings,
Wrath began again.
Have you ever been to the mountains in Sierra?
He asked. Felix shook his head. Wrath continued.
It is a sparse country with high altitude. The only things that live there are tough sage, hard rocks, and harder people.
Wrath stopped pacing and stood facing Felix.
Those people, my clan, my pack, survive because they learn to take from the land what is useful. Take to survive.
Wrath's eyes flash golden amber in the waning light of the sun.
Is what you offer useful?
His last word was a challenge. Felix was stunned by the question and was unsure how to answer. Had not the wolves sent for the parley? The prince's head reeled as potential answers flew through his mind in rapid succession. Was he at liberty to offer them additional terms? He glanced back towards his company, where Captain Waddle still sat astride Mara, watching him and Wrath with a stony face. The knolls seemed to shrink about them. The tall grasses on the edge loomed up, closing in. Felix turned back and desperately wished that Vlad had come with him. Vladimir had always been quick with his wit and clever of tongue. The prince's distress must have shown on his face, for Wrath spoke again.
Perhaps this will help,
Wrath said as he unbuckled his sword. He held it out horizontally at arm's length. Felix's paw went slowly to the hilt of his own sword and gripped it tightly, unsure what the wolf was playing at. However, Wrath gently raised the scabbard of the sword to eye level, so Felix could see the width of the blade clearly, and began to slowly unsheath it. Silver inlay sparkled brilliantly in the rays of the afternoon sun. Etched patterns of waves crashed down the length of the long blade. The display was mesmerizing and beautiful to watch as the leaf blade left the confines of the cobalt scabbard. Wrath dropped the scabbard, and it hit the grass with a small thud as he displayed the blade in its singular beauty. Something clicked in Felix's head. Wait, Felix said slowly as sudden realization struck him. I know that sword.
Torrent,
Wrath said in a blunt tone.
Aspen steel quenched in Drake's blood. This, my young friend, is useful.
How came you by my uncle's sword? Felix asked. His voice was no longer steady, but sounded thin. That blade is an heirloom to my family. Somewhere deep down, Felix thought he might know the answer, but ignored it.
Ironfoot was one hell of a warrior,
Wrath said simply. He shifted his grip and unwrapped something bound tight around the pommel of the hilt.
"How came you by it?"
Felix said in gathering wrath. He pulled his own sword free from its scabbard in a rush.
"Tell me,"
the prince demanded, his voice raised and thick with emotion. At Felix's shout, the rabbits at the edge of the clearing gripped their spears tightly and looked around warily with ears alert and eyes sharp. The scouts had fitted shafts to their bowstrings and were holding at a half-draw. However, Felix's echoing voice was the only foe they heard. Captain Waddle was brandishing his own sword, but held the rest of the guard steady with a word. Wrath finished unwrapping the pommel and let a thin ribbon drop freely to hang. A breeze blew slightly across the knoll, and for the first time, Felix saw clearly what was trailing from the sword's hilt. An inch-wide ribbon of what was clearly auburn rabbit hide, flecked with strands of gray. Felix's eyes went wide with horror.
"Butcher!"
was all that Felix's numb lips managed to get out, as a strange bird call sounded across the clearing.
"Keep your enemies close,"
Wrath said, running the pelt through his fingers. A heartbeat passed. Then a piercing howl split across the silent clearing. A horrible, pain-riddled yowl echoed off the wooden sentinels that watched the knoll so intently. Felix's heart skipped a beat as he looked back at his company of soldiers, searching for the source of the terrible cry. His lion, Honor, thrashed and plunged, striking out wildly with his 2-inch-long claws. Suddenly, he stumbled and collapsed under the weight of an array of spears that pierced through his tawny hide. Then Felix saw them. Wolves. Big wolves. Strong wolves. Many wolves. All swelled up around his guard. They were garbed in a raiment that looked like grass, tied intricately throughout their fur, and they held wicked axes, or long, deadly spears. Felix barely had time to register what he was seeing before wrath was upon him. Instinct saved him more than skill, as Felix yanked his blade up in time to catch the crashing blow from Torrent. 2 more blows rang out sharp and clear as Felix backpedaled, struggling to parry the Torrent with his unfamiliar blade. Wrath had speed and leverage with the longer bastard sword. Its tip whistled through the air, the blade flowing in a seamless blur as the next blow passed a whisker in front of Felix's nose, causing him to jerk back and stumble over his own feet. Wrath slowly circled Felix like a hawk, eventually coming around to cut him off from the rest of his company. Felix stole a glance at the chaos reigning among his guards. Captain Waddle had been dismounted. Heavy nets seemed to have been thrown over his lion Mara and staked soundly into the ground. One of Felix's heavy guards was also netted, and 3 wolves stabbed viciously at the constrained rabbit. The guard's long spear was worthless in his confinement and dropped heavily from his paws as he fell to their blades. In the distance, one of the scouts had made a break for the trees. Agile and swift, he shot arrows back at his pursuers. An unlucky wolf faltered, falling to his knees, riddled with barbed shafts. The scout had nearly made free to the edge of the tree line when suddenly the woods came alive. Dark brown they were, entangled with thorns and their armor made from bark. The scout gave one scream before the awaiting wolves silenced him. Wrath advanced upon Felix again, faster than his bulk should allow. The wolf's first blow was a feint. Felix realized this too late and was forced to catch the follow-up cut upon the crossguard of his sword. Wrath used this inopportune moment to close the gap to a span and grabbed the prince's wrist, pinning his blade against the aspen steel of Torrent. Wrath stood looming, an entire head taller than Prince Felix. Felix pushed with all of his might against Wrath, but the wolf didn't budge. With amber eyes ablaze, Wrath opened his jaws and bit viciously into Felix's shoulder. Felix's leather pauldron took the brunt of the force, and Wrath whipped his head from side to side, which lifted Felix slightly off the ground. Wrath released him slightly, then bit down again with greater force, and the pauldron buckled. Pain laced through Felix's right shoulder and arm. His fingers went numb, and his sword dropped, point down, into the grass. This time he felt every ravishing, every thrash the wolf admonished. The prince screamed. Panic consumed him. He was fraught with pain. In desperation, Felix lifted both his feet, trusting his weight to the tearing jaws, and kicked out with all of his strength against the chest of Wrath. Leather straps snapped and skin ripped as Felix tumbled away across the grass. His paw went immediately to his chest under his jerkin, and when he pulled it away, bright red blood coated his glove. Felix looked in horror at the blood, thick on his paw. Crimson was the only thought that ran through his befuddled mind. Wrath was already back on his feet, slightly winded from Felix's gambit, but closing the distance. The wolf licked the blood coating his muzzle. The sword torrent was raised high, ready to cascade once more. Felix felt death advancing and scrambled backwards, pulling at the glove on his paw. Silver and crimson flared to life as the last rays of the afternoon light hit Felix's ring, the crimson catalyst. He couldn't remember the training or what the books had said, but with desperate intent, he reached with paw outstretched and yelled a wordless bid for freedom. Wrath's blade descended as a ripple of blinding bright light burst forth. A fountain of grass and soil sprung up as the aspen blade made landfall, gouging a deep wound into the earth. Wrath could not see, his vision was a blur, but his ear twitched and he whipped the sword around, judging the direction of the sound, but the blade only found air. Rapid footfalls retreated in the springy grass, and Wrath pursued the sound as best he could, but pulled up short when he came to the edge of the clearing. The wolf reached up and rubbed his eyes with his thumb and forefinger as the sound of the rabbit crashing through the foliage faded into the thick brush. Wrath let fall his paw and examined the thick leaves blocking the path. A clear blood trail speckled every other leaf. The wolf stared hungrily into the gloom of the forest, contemplating. What was useful now was his tracker. Wrath turned gracefully on his heel and made his way back toward his expectant pack. Felix gasped for breath, his back against a thick oak tree. The panic technique he had done had saved him, and then adrenaline had taken him this far before his strength failed. He looked down, examining his ravaged shoulder. Pain shot through it whenever he moved or breathed. A howl echoed in the distance, harrowing amongst the dense, dark trees. Night had come on quickly under the cover of the forest. Felix noticed that on this side of the clearing, the forest trees grew bigger and wilder, taking on twisted, haunted forms. He needed somewhere to hide. He needed to rest. However, he had to keep moving. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. The world swayed dangerously before his eyes, and he reached out to steady himself against the oak. Another howl sounded, this time from a different direction. They were closing in on him. The prince forced himself into a reluctant trot, all his broken body would allow. Trees went past in a blur of pain. He focused all his energy on breathing and putting one foot in front of the other. Another step. Another step. Breathe. Another step. The mental rote was mechanical, and the only thing keeping him on his feet as he moved forward, deeper into the forest. Felix lost track of time in his toil, and had no clue how far he had come. He felt more than saw an overwhelming presence looming before him. The prince looked up at a gargantuan tree. It was twisted and ancient, with a height and breadth so large multiple families could have made a burrow of it. It reminded him of the great tree in the capital of Landor, but its presence accosted his every sense. Well, burrow, it could be nothing else. Felix shambled slowly towards an opening, a gaping maw set within the folds of huge, thick roots, pitch black in the near night. He paused and looked up in fear at the wild branches that stretched far above any other tree in the forest. Yet another howl split the dark air. What other choice did he have? Felix stepped gingerly down into the deep, awaiting darkness. Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.